Hi, this is Phil Cooke, and welcome to the Phil Cooke Podcast. Today, we've got an interview with David Middlebrook from churchlawyers.com. Now, David is an attorney. I've known him for decades now. He's done a lot of work for our company, Cooke Media Group, and he is a friend to churches, ministries, and nonprofits. They have an amazing team that are experts in all areas that deal with that kind of law. And we're going to talk today a little bit about some of the crisis situations that have been happening out there, how to avoid them, what to do to stay ahead of them, and how to navigate through them. So you're going to want to stay tuned to this interview. And if you know someone who's a ministry leader going through a crisis, send them this episode because it's going to be terrific. So let's go to the interview with David Middlebrook. David Middlebrook, thanks for being on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. You and I have been friends for a long time as well. So absolutely welcome. It's time we heard some advice from an attorney.
Right.
Absolutely. Right. Never hurts.
I'm not doing attorney jokes. I'm not doing it.
Oh man, I'm trying to set you up here. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about your past. How did you get into this whole thing? How did you get into the kind of the niche, or niche, as our British friends say, of helping churches, ministries, nonprofits? How did all that happen?
You know, I literally was raised in church, teething on a church pew. One of my first memories as a human being was my two grandmothers giving me little butterscotch lifesavers to keep me from crying. And I looked up and saw my grandfather preaching. My other grandfather was sitting in the king chair behind him, and my mom was playing the organ. And I thought, I love this place. And so
that's great.
That got me started. I was really groomed to be a pastor. And on my way to seminary, my dad says, well, you know, why are you in a hurry? Why don't you go to law school? And so I came down to SMU, went to law school, and as Providence would have it, the law firm I went to work for was representing a big televangelist in the midst of a crisis. It was a personal family hero of ours. I
Wow.
jokingly say it was a bigger deal than if Bono would have been a client. I mean, it was just huge. And I began to think about it. And I one of my favorite books is To Kill a Mockingbird. I remember my English teacher in high school said that Atticus Finch was the most Christ-like figure in American literature. And I thought, wow, you can be a Christian, you can be a professional. And I got a big dose of that. I went to Oral Roberts University. So going into every man's world was kind of a natural for me. And so that's how I started doing this 36 years ago.
That's fantastic. So what do you tell people? What do you tell pastors and leaders who don't have an attorney, don't have a relationship with an attorney? What do you tell those guys?
Well, there's a lot of attorneys out there. What I hear mostly is, well, we got an attorney on the board. Well, what does he or she do? Well, they're a family law attorney. Okay. Yes. Well, what does he or she do? He's a bankruptcy lawyer. And I was like, that's great. I'm not a family law attorney. I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer. I'm sure he or she's a great person. Love to get to meet him. But you need a church lawyer. You need a ministry lawyer, because there's just so many nuances and so many aspects of the law that the Constitution provides for, that they need to take advantage of that. And then, like I said, I've been doing this my whole career, soup to nuts, beginning to end, from incorporation to merger and dissolution and everything else in between. And so I got a big gaggle of lawyers around here, and that's what we all feel like God called us to do.
We don't necessarily live in a hostile culture. I should say, we don't necessarily live in a persecuted culture, but we certainly live in a hostile culture in many ways when it comes to churches, ministry organizations, God stuff. And so, I think it's important that pastors and ministry leaders have their arsenal full, because they're going to get attacked. They're going to get criticized. Something's going to happen. I even remember a church in California that the city tried to use eminent domain to take over part of their property to sell to a big box store. And that took years to resolve. So pastors, I don't think, grab the wide range.
I know that Costco case, but yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, I don't think pastors realize the wide range of attacks they can get from all directions.
I'll tell you, I had a law professor, he's a Jewish guy, taught trial advocacy in law school at SMU. And I was kind of explaining to him what I felt like I was going to do in my career. And his first thing was, well, you'll never make a living. And that's not true. And then secondly, he said, and he paused and he goes, how cool would it be to go into a trial and you look at the jury panel and you know that 10 out of 12 are always going to be with you because you're the good guy representing the church. And I think that was true 36 years ago.
Yeah.
I would say, I don't know if it's flipped totally the other direction, but there's a lot of people that feel differently about the church today than they did then. So I don't know if I probably would use the H word. It's a hostile environment in which we live.
I think, it's interesting you say that because in my book, The Way Back, I talk about the fact that, 30 years ago, a political candidate needed to be a church member. He needed to show up on Sundays. That would establish him. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
character really, really mattered.
Yes.
Character really, really mattered. And it still matters to me. We were raised that way.
Yeah.
But it's surprising to me. I get the opportunity to work with bunch of young lawyers that, coming out of law school or whatever. And when I start talking about politics, for example, and character matters in a candidate or whatever, and they're like, why?
Amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. And it's disheartening, but then you tell them why and they go, oh, well, I see that. The environment's definitely changed a lot. And so we are busy growing, got clients all over the place, work with from church plants to mega churches to media ministries and everything in between. And I just still feel so blessed to play a role in what is going on in the kingdom. I was raised in a very kind of myopic world. I thought, here's our denomination and maybe the Catholic Church, and then there's a smattering of these other people, and now 36 years later, I don't think of it that way at all. I'm not myopic. I think of it as a giant quilt. It's like the Lord has patched together all of these things that makes this amazing, beautiful quilt that we call the kingdom of God and the church. And so, I feel very, very blessed to be able to do what I do.
Now, is there a particular area that you seem to get the most calls about in when it comes to churches and ministry organizations these days?
Well, if you're asking for me, I would say, if you walk down the hallway and talk to other lawyers, I don't think they would be able to say this. As the founder of the firm, when it's most radioactive, the building's on fire, the whatever, I get those calls more frequently than they do, but it's just by virtue of me having done this for a long time. But yeah, man, we do everything. Some of it's very mundane from the perspective of the client. For bylaws, for example.
Yeah.
Bylaws, not really important, right? They're super important. They're the laws that's where we get the term, the laws by which you have to live, and you will be governed by those laws. And so you got to take time and really make those things reflect who you are. I always say, hold your bylaws up like they're a mirror and look in that mirror and go, is that me? Is that who I want to be someday? Or that's not the guy down the road or the church that I really want to, no, that reflects who we are and what we do. And the reason why that's important is if you find yourself in front of a judge, he or she, because of the protections we have in the Constitution, is going to hold you to those laws. Those are the laws by which you have to behave. And if you don't, you're in trouble.
Well, over and over, I see churches that get into trouble in areas like this because when they just, were in a guy's living room to start a church, they didn't take that stuff seriously. It's no big deal. We're getting 25 people to come in. Now they've grown up to thousands of members, and suddenly those that not taking those things seriously in the early days have come back to haunt them years later.
It does, and we could go through headlines that are happening right this very day. About issues related to something what, again, can seem very mundane, but super, super important. And it's really a holistic practice that we have. We really try to look at it from beginning to end. And back to the bylaws thing, it always tickles me. I'll be talking to some church planter or some guy that's got 500 people in his church, and I see your bylaws, and they hand me this 58-page document. And I'm like, do you do any of that? No, but we will someday. And I go, no, man, that's not the deal. Let's make it who you are. So
it's like, from my perspective as a media communication guy, I ask them about their mission statement. And a mission statement is something they create, print out, frame it, put it on the wall, and yet nobody in the organization can tell you what the mission statement is. I mean, they completely forget about it. Yeah. And so I'm not a big mission statement guy, but it's just interesting how little we take seriously when it comes to this stuff. And I think it's important. And I think, things have changed. When my dad was a pastor, he didn't have social media to deal with. He didn't have intellectual property to deal with. There's so many things that a previous generation of pastors, it never crossed their mind. And I think a good example is reporting abuse cases. Back in those early days, those laws either weren't on the books or they were just being made, and they were different all over the country, and reporting requirements. I mean, tell me about that. That's all kind of come together today. So it's a whole different ballgame, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And there are variations on the theme, but the general theme of all of the states as it relates to child abuse reporting is if you have reason to believe that there's harm or abuse or neglect that's occurring to a child, then you have a reporting requirement. And back in the day, I guess we'll have a big back in the day conversation. I remember back in the day when I was talking to churches and I'd say, hey, you know what? You ought to do a background check on your employees and your volunteers. And you know what they said? Well, that's expensive.
Oh, brother.
Fast forward to where we are today. If you're not at least doing that, you're not even coming close to meeting a standard of care that you'll be held to if something bad goes wrong. So, yeah, things have really, really changed. It is much more complex. There's so many more issues. So I'm excited about talking about the topic today. I think the PR guys get a bad rap sometimes because they call it the PR crisis. I'm like, no. PR did not create the crisis. You got a crisis and some PR issues. Okay, so
that's true. That's true.
The PR guy didn't do it. So just thinking about that. And again, one of my sayings, I probably heard me say it, Phil, but I mean, most things are not events; they're process. Okay, so you have to have
Okay, so we talked about that on a panel in Athens, Greece, I think, last year. Take them through that, because that's really, really good.
Well, first of all, let's just talk about how, long before the crisis occurs, there needs to be a process that takes place. And I'm not talking about the dusty black 3-ring binder that you can't find or you've never read or checked the box on. We're talking about a process in terms of how are we going to deal with the crisis. And for my Word of Faith friends, if you're listening, you're not going to like what I'm going to say, but I will tell you, if you're in ministry long enough, it is a certainty there's going to be a crisis arise. It's a certainty. Now, what is the nature of the crisis? I don't know. And I don't think you have to sit down and try to come up with playbooks for every single crisis. I encourage clients to go, look, let's take it 3 ways. This process we're going to go through. We're going to consider a crisis externally. Well, what can an external crisis be? I don't know, hurricane, tornado, earthquake. I was in California last week in the gas thing, and they moved 40,000 people out of Southern California.
Yes.
That's a crisis. That's an external crisis, and we need to be prepared to handle that. Then the second category just to make it simple, we're going to do 3, internally. An internal crisis, and we could tick off. It could be a moral failure. It could be a death of a pet. I don't know, but it happened internally. We need to be able to manage that. And then there's a third category that's separate and apart from the other 2, and that's just anything involving children.
Yeah.
And you've got to really be prepared to do that. So the process, it's not, what is that saying? The first casualty of war is the battle plan. Okay, so we don't have to sit around and come up with the perfect plan for every possible scenario. But if we think of external, internal, and kids, okay, what are we going to do? So we have to identify those risks. You can always expand the list later. But just say in those 3 categories, those 3 buckets. And after you've identified those, one step that a lot of people jump over, and they're like, okay, we're ready when the crisis happens. I'm like, pause.
Yes.
Let's try to figure out what crisis we can avoid.
Yeah.
Through risk management. Let's
Yes.
just do the whole Proverbs thing, look down the road, see problems, and try to avoid them. I mean, because in the going through this process of planning to respond to a crisis, you're going to see things and go, really, we ought to get a little better at that, or we ought to think about doing this, et cetera, et cetera. So be open to that.
Good.
Okay.
That's good.
And so, then you then can begin to think about how we're going to have a team to respond to this, a crisis communications team. And it literally is a Goldilocks rule. I mean, it can't be too many people. It can't be too few people. It might be a different group if it involves a child versus it involves something that had happened externally. I mean, you guys got to figure all that kind of stuff out. But I do know this: it's got to be the right group of people, and so you're going to think about, is the senior pastor going to be involved? Is the executive pastor going to be involved? What about our insurance guy? What about our PR media guy? What about the attorney? Because I'll tell you this is a fact, and I was thinking about our conversation today. How many times do those people that fly on airplanes
Yep.
tune out when the flight attendant brings out the mask and says, put it on, make sure you have it on your face so that goes through. I was watching last night when I was flying home, and nobody was paying any attention to the flight attendant.
Yep.
None. And so you've got to be serious about this. And part of the drill, there should be a drill aspect to, once you've come up with a plan, to think about how are we going to execute on the plan? Because why do we have to put that mask on? Hypoxia. We know that the lack of oxygen in a room will cause you not to be able to think right until you pass out. That's why they say put that mask on, right? Well, you have to have not a physical mask, but a metaphorical mask. It's like, I can't think right now. This crisis is so significant. It's existential. If we don't handle this correctly, then my career, my family, all the congregants, maybe even the church building's going to go away.
Yeah.
It's not the time to try to figure it out. That's when you want to go back to your process and go, man, I got a team. I'm going to call these people and we're going to get together, whether it's in person, on Zoom, or however. We're going to look at each other and talk this through, because the next few steps that we take or don't take can have a permanent impact on the health of this organization, our church, or our ministry. So
that's great.
I think about those things because I've been in those rooms, and it's, like, I could go war story after war story here, but I was on the phone one time recently, and I was talking to a pastor, and he could not hardly form a sentence. It was so serious. It's so weighty. It was like, I don't know what to do. And I said, well, great. I do. Here we go. Okay. So
good.
Yeah, I just I think that again, people get hung up on the black notebook with 3-ring binder. Yeah. We have to think of every possible thing, and I'm like, no, you really don't. What you have to think of is, what are we going to do when the crisis rises? Who are we going to assemble? Because we've already thought about that. We don't have to go look up their numbers or anything. Their speed dial on my phone, and we're going to get together and then consider what our next step is going to be.
That's fantastic. Now, let's go back to the Proverbs thing, looking ahead and being aware. One of the things in my book, Church on Trial, that I wrote about was we're Christians, so we want to believe
I've never read it. I just keep it right here on my desk.
And I love subtle advertising.
I would direct people to the endorsement on page 4. I mean,
the very gracious endorsement. But in there, I talk about red flags. We're Christians. We want to think the best about everybody. So when we see our executive pastor coming in the morning, strangely looking like he's got a hangover, we think, you know what, Bob will figure this out. He'll work it out. That's not a problem. And we just kind of ignore it. But I've seen so many situations where just noticing a red flag can save the place from crashing and burning. I don't think we take it's not about being a behavior cop at church. You're not there to criticize everybody, but we should notice things, that youth leader that's spending a little too much time with one of the minor girls in the youth group,
Right.
Little things like that can blow up to something really significant. I just think that's so important.
I totally agree. And I'm going to coin a phrase right now. I'm sure you've never heard it before, but that is see something, say something.
Yeah. Like at the airport.
Yeah. Like go, hey man, that's not right. And then, once we kind of get past that and we realize we are in, however we define it, externally, internally, children, whatever, we're in a crisis. What are we going to do? That's, now look, I think you would agree with this statement, but most pastors, senior pastors of thriving, growing, dynamic churches are alpha. They are alpha personalities.
Yeah.
And they're like, give me that microphone. Let me talk to the media. I'm going to handle it. And you're like, you're really probably the person we least want you to do that. Why is that? Because that's going to be out on the internet forever. And people are going to identify, whether you did anything wrong or not, they're going to identify you in that crisis. So you need to think about, and your book does a great job of it. You do a great job of it, but you need to think about that. Who's going to be our spokesperson?
Yeah.
How are we going to handle media? One of the most revolutionary ideas that people, when we're in the middle of a crisis, let's say, well, what are we going to do about media? And I say, well, you need to get an email address called media@blankchurch.com and have all that stuff go in there so it can be filtered, it can be logged, it can be categorized, and we can determine what we're going to do. Don't just fly by the seat of your pants here, and sometimes too, I've had pastors before, they're in the middle of a crisis, like, man, this is great. We're going to be on TV. I'm going to stand out in front of the church and be interviewed with the sign in the background. And I'm like, well, that assumes a lot of good things are going to come out of this.
Yes.
And I will pause and say this, though. You never want to let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
Because that's when you want to get into that post-mortem. And once you've gotten through it, say, how can we do this better, et cetera? But you're not going to be thinking about that at the time. And so I think having an agreement, going back to the process itself, having an agreement about who's going to be involved, how we're going to handle it, what we're going to do, having what pilots use. I'm talking about airplanes today, but how many times some guy's been flying his whole life and he still has to go through that checklist.
Yes.
Why? Because that's what pilots do, because they don't want to miss anything. So we want a checklist.
That's good. Now, one of the, I love what you're saying about pastors' expectations of what's going to happen if a crisis occurs. One of the things I get a lot is pastors who will say, Phil, okay, we've had this catastrophe. Can you help massage the story so we sound better? And I always tell them, look, that's not the way to go. How about if we tell the truth? How about if we just get the truth out there? But they think that if they just tell the story differently, it'll be okay. And oh my gosh, that's just not the case at all.
I think that there's so many areas. Let's talk about AI for a moment, which, by the way, I heard a guy say the other day, and it really stuck with me. He goes, all these people are worried about AI. I'm just focusing on the great I am.
That's good.
That's
good.
Preach, brother. But for example, I think because of AI, because of computer technology and all that, we get to where we don't trust anything that we see or hear.
Yeah.
So that means we need to even more be more diligent and upping our game and making sure that people understand when this person speaks on behalf of our organization, that's a trusted source. And I think a crisis well handled sends a message to your community, your congregation, the people in your world that you got your stuff together.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, that's really good. That's really good. I also think, it's interesting that particularly when it comes to reporting minor situations with minors. I've seen pastors threatened with jail because even though they had nothing to do with it, because they didn't report it in a timely manner. That's a pretty serious thing too, right?
That's very serious. I mean, you can't make blanket statements, but most of the state reporting requirements, it is not a felony, but at least a misdemeanor failure to report. Now, look, all of that, in the weeds, legal mumbo jumbo doesn't really matter when the story is Pastor X was arrested or Pastor X was arraigned or or sued or whatever the deal was, and it then plus child abuse.
Yes.
Yeah, now it's just guilt by association.
Yes. Oh man, that's true. Now, and this all just goes on. We could do this for hours. You and I have seen a couple situations or a number of situations where something went down that was super serious, super heavy, and yet they felt like our in-house attorney who handles contracts can take care of all this. And let's go back to your earlier comment about you need a specialist. You need somebody that knows how to deal with a crisis situation. So as you said, I'm sure that your in-house attorney that deals with contracts is a nice person, is well qualified, but a crisis is a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, it is. And it's different. It's different in the way that the ER is different than just a hospital room. Okay. I mean, when you're in the ER, somebody comes in and it's a huge mess. You got to triage them. You got to find the right people. You got to bandage them up. Yep. You got to make sure that the person survives the immediate. And so those few hours, I used to say you probably got 24 hours. Man, I don't even, in the world in which we live in, maybe it's 4. I mean, really, you got, right? I mean, people are going to be drawing conclusions by what they hear, read, and see in a very short amount of time. And so all the more reason to have this plan, this process in place so that you can, irrespective of what the crisis is, you know how you're going to handle it. And I think as it relates to, if I have to have brain surgery, I don't want the podiatrist doing it. I mean, I just don't. And that doesn't mean I don't like podiatrists. I do. But something. If you've got a bone sticking out of your leg and you're like, I don't know if we're ever going to walk again. I'd like an orthopedic surgeon involved, sir, please.
Yes.
Okay, so that's really kind of the thing that I think I'm most proud about what we do around here is we don't do anything else. And I get calls all the time. People say, hey, could you just help me with this? And dude, I'll find you a number to call somebody or a friend, but I just don't do that. I work with pastors, churches, and ministries. That's what I do.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So it's a big spectrum of things, but it's a very narrow focus in terms of who we work for.
So if there was one piece of advice you could give to a typical pastor or ministry leader out there right now, what would it be?
I would say don't put your head in the sand. Don't be fearful. Don't think that, if you're going to do some crisis planning and think about how we're going to have a process to respond to a crisis, whatever it is, it's not a waste of time. I think I would say, it shouldn't be you, but you need to identify somebody in your organization that owns this, somebody that knows this. Somebody that even you or senior pastor and the oxygen's been sucked out of the room and you're thinking about all of this stuff, somebody that can be laser focused and help you navigate what is a crisis. And I think that's critically important. It's not a time to go find your lawyer. You should have a good lawyer. It's not a time to go find a PR guy. You should have a good PR guy. And it's not a time to go, where's our insurance policy?
Boy, that's what that's a big issue because a church could go. I mean, a legal issue like this could bankrupt a church. So insurance matters, right?
It does matter. Insurance does matter. And again, I'm not I know pastors have to wear so many hats. I'm not trying to throw another hat in the ring and say, you need to wear this too. I'm saying I would encourage anyone that has a church in the environment in which we live today to identify someone that can be schooled and skilled and ready to go, and you can pull the trigger, and when you pull that trigger, it's going to start a really healthy process to help your church get through whatever it is.
Now, let me throw in that from my perspective, already having an attorney, already having a communications advisor, consultant, the benefit of that is they know you. They know the DNA of the church. They've been with you for years. They know what the personalities and leadership. And so hiring somebody at the last minute during a crisis, they're going to have to catch up. They're going to have to figure out, okay, what is this church about? Who's in leadership? What's been going on? What's the staff situation? That's a lot of homework to do really fast. Because as you say, in a text message, email world, word travels fast. And
really fast.
If we don't respond quickly, people are going to start making stuff up. And I don't know about you, but I've always discovered when people make stuff up, when they start guessing what's going on, it's always worse than what really went on.
Always.
And you just don't want that. So I'm just a big believer of getting it out there as soon as possible and getting that story told. So, all right, what website, if you want more information, where can they go?
Yeah, thechurchlawyers.com.
Thechurchlawyers.com. I'm going to encourage people, go check it out, because you need a specialist when you know what hits the fan. And that's no time to fool around. Have a relationship already. And I think these guys, David's team, is absolutely amazing. So thank you so much for being on. We should do this regularly, because there's so much stuff coming up in the news today.
Coming up.
Oh my God.
Well, you know what? I'll send you an email when I see something. You do the same. But I love visiting there's nothing more satisfying than helping a church get through a crisis.
Yeah.
There's nothing more. I'll give you one word picture of this. I was in the middle of a client crisis, and I just needed to take a break. I was like in the middle of this big room, and all these big issues are being discussed. And I said, hey, I'm going to take a little walk. And so I walked out into the auditorium, and it was completely black. I mean, but for the little floor lighting, I would have fallen off the thing. And I thought, wow, we're on the verge. We're on the precipice of a dark, empty room if we don't get this right. And fortunately we did, but it was, these things it's not like TV, man. It doesn't get wrapped up in 22 minutes.
That's right.
You got to go through those things. But I'm proud to say on the other side that the church is doing great. The enemy wanted to shut us down. Yeah. And so we all come from a different perspective. We did our jobs, and people listened. And now, I learned a lot going through it. Every time I go through a major crisis, I learn a lot. Yeah. And I know you do too.
Yeah. Well, I've also seen, you and I both have seen churches that were forced to close because they didn't handle the crisis well. They didn't have insurance, or they didn't respond well. Things get out of hand remarkably quickly.
Fast. It's really, really fast. We live in it's lightning fast compared to when I first started doing this.
So like you say, don't live in fear, but we need to have the resources ready to go, ready to pull the trigger. And I, so many pastors just believe it's never going to happen to me. It's never going to happen to our church. We're doing the right things, but I'll tell you, you just don't know where a crisis could come from.
We represent hundreds and hundreds of churches across this country. And I'm not trying to be Debbie Downer, but I'm telling you, if I could line up every single senior pastor of every successful church that we represent, they would have more than a handful of major crises that they have. And you just never know where they're coming from. That's why I don't get too hung up on the playbook for each individual potential crisis, because there's so many, but it's about the process.
That's good. That's good. Well, thank you so much for being on. Like I say, we'll do this again, because this is such a deep subject, and I appreciate you being so consistent and helpful to pastors all over the country. So thanks a lot, and we'll talk later. Well, David's amazing. His team is incredible. And I encourage you, if you're a ministry leader, a church leader, executive pastor, you need to get their information at thechurchlawyers.com and just have a relationship. Start calling them, talk to them. They'll chat with you and kind of help you through your situation. And even if you're not in a crisis, like we've said on this thing, have that relationship ready. And by the way, if you have questions about legal stuff, I mean, really not legal stuff. I'm not a lawyer or a counselor, but my book, Church on Trial, How to Protect Your Congregation, Mission, and Reputation During a Crisis, was written out of years and years and years, decades really, of helping churches navigate a crisis like this. So my area is communication. How do we tell the congregation? How do we tell the general public? Do we release a statement? Do we talk to reporters? So many questions related when a crisis happens. And we've seen it handled so poorly lately with churches across the country. We've seen it in the news, and it's just been a travesty. And it really sets the Christian cause back so much when a church or ministry doesn't handle it well. In the book, I talk about the staggering number of people who leave the church because of how poorly that church handled a crisis. So this is a big deal out there, and we need to figure it out. So I'd encourage you, if you're a leader in a church today, you need to get a copy of my book, Church on Trial: How to Protect Your Congregation, Mission, and Reputation During a Crisis. Thanks again to David. It was a great conversation. We'll do it again, and I'll see you the next time.